I'm talking about the pay that's afforded the Secretary-General of the Department of Health, Robert Watt, now earning close to €298,000. And when you look at getting, I guess, value for money out there, when we talk about the big discrepancy between what people are earning and those at the very top are earning, do you think that's too much money?
I think one point that's very much missed from the argument over this is, this is not Robert Watt's salary. This is a salary we decided before he got the job is the salary that we would pay the Secretary-General of the Department of Health. When Robert Watt ceases to be Secretary-General of the Department of Health, whenever that happens, the person who succeeds him will get that same salary. So the salary doesn't just go to the person, it goes to the role.
We decided for the role. If we're not talking about the person, but 298,000, and it's not going to stop at that, because we know that under public sector pay deals that's actually going to go up. It's on course to be over €300,000. And for people watching in tonight who are struggling with those energy bills, who are struggling to put food on the table, they think that's galling. That's too much.
Think about the nature of the job, though. This is the head of our health service, effectively, the head of the Department of Health, running a budget of 22,000 million a year, 22 billion, responsible for 150,000 employees, responsible for managing the pandemic, responsible for getting our health service into a better space. I know that department because I used to be the minister there. A 22 billion euro budget, if that's 1% out, that costs the Irish people 220 million euros.
We know as well the record figures we're hearing from our emergency departments right now, and the big job and the big task that's at hand in the health service. So there's pressure then to deliver, isn't there?
Yeah, and thankfully last year was one of the very few years where the health service came in on budget, in fact slightly under budget. We're seeing very high attendances at the moment in emergency departments. Thankfully that is not translated into the highest ever trolley numbers. There are still far too many people on trolleys, for sure. They are, and they very often are this time of year, unfortunately. But, we're putting huge investment into our health service at the moment. A lot of people don't know this. We have 40% more doctors than we had 10 years ago, both consultants and NCHDs. We have 40,000 midwives and nurses now, almost the highest per head or per bed in the developed world. We have 2,000 more beds than we had 5 years ago. So huge investment is going in.
But we know
hit by the pandemic, hit by the cyber attack.
Those waiting lists that remain as well. And of course, Launchacare and what's happening there. So there is a big job at hand. But I want to move on to look at wage demands. And we know that the unions are in talks now about, I suppose, grappling with the cost of living and how workers should be paid accordingly. There's huge expectation. You said yourself that employers, if they can afford to give people a pay rise, should do that. Therefore, you can see why the unions would say, all workers should get a pay rise. Shouldn't they? And isn't this something now that you're going to have to face going into the next couple of months as those talks come to a fruition?
Well, as you know, an increase in the national minimum wage kicked in only a few weeks ago. Since the Low Pay Commission was established in 2016, we've seen a 26% increase in the minimum wage. Prices have gone up by about 7% since then. We have a pay deal to pay public servants more. There's also, the additional public holiday, which is an extra day's pay without work as well. So there are a number of things that are already agreed. But in the context where we have inflation and the cost of living is rising, it's not unreasonable for workers to say to their employer that they want their pay to be increased, and that will happen. But we need to bear in mind two things. There are some employers that won't be able to pay. And the last thing we want is employers having to lay people off or cut people's hours if they can't afford to pay. So there's a difference between those who can afford to pay and those who can't. And I suppose the other thing that we need to bear in mind as well is that we want to avoid a wage inflation spiral. This can be self-defeating, unfortunately, because if, for example, an employer has to pay the staff 5% more, how will they fund that? They increase prices by 5% more, and you then create a spiral where people have increased wages, but they're actually not any better off, and that's something we need to try to avoid.
Okay, so when you said that should employers be in a position to pay people more they should, were you saying that also worrying about the impact that could have?
Yeah, of course, because this is life and this is economics, and there's so many different moving parts, and any action has knock-on effects and knock-on reactions. But that's exactly why I come back to the point that I made earlier. If we just treat the symptoms of inflation, if we just keep chasing higher prices with higher wages, with higher welfare, and you do need to do that, by the way, that's the symptoms. That won't solve the problem, and that's why we need an anti-inflation strategy. Inflation could be with us for a couple of years, and that's why it can't just be about this wage inflation spiral where we're always chasing higher prices. We have to do the other things as well. It means changes in monetary policy. It means having a discussion with the social partners, which we will have, around incomes policy. It means doing more around competition and consumer protection. And, you know, in my department, Minister Troy and I have published 2 new pieces of legislation to strengthen the Competition Authority and to strengthen consumer law. There are other ways that you can bring inflation under control. And if the only thing we do is treat the symptoms, and yes, we do need to treat the symptoms, we won't actually solve the problem.
Yeah, are workers potentially likely to see a pay rise, though, later this year? We know the unions are talking. We know that they've laid out the issues that are there as everyone is feeling the pinch. Are we likely to see that, or is this likely to be a very testy time between government and unions?
Most workers will see a pay rise this year. And we know that already from the tax returns, for example. There are more people at work, people are working more hours, and they're being paid more. Of course, every individual person's experience is different, but most workers will get a pay rise this year.
You expect that?
Well, I know that, you know, because we've agreed modest pay increases in the public service. There's increases in the minimum wage. There's increases in other sector rates. And I know what I hear from the IDA, and I know what I hear from private sector employers. And I know what I hear from the unions as well, that they are successfully negotiating pay increases in the private sector. OK,
to go above and beyond, though, what's already being talked about, potentially, can you see that happening? Well,
these things are negotiated. And very often, you know, what an organisation or an employer or the public service will say is that we can agree a pay rise because it's right that you should get a pay rise. We can afford to do it. You need to protect your income against inflation, but also we need things in return. You know, we need changes in productivity. We need changes in work practices. We need to part fund that by doing our business differently or better, and that's the kind of negotiations that happen.